Jesus died. So what? That's the subject of our Conversant podcast today, as we talk with Michael Wadsworth and Greg Whittick about what does it mean that Jesus died? What's the significance for us? We're going to look at 4 different ways that Jesus' death and resurrection has been understood through Christian history and see what that means for us today. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Conversant podcast, conversations in theology, church, culture, and mission. And we are really excited today to talk about the subject of why did Jesus die? Jesus died. Hey, so what? What's the point? And we've got 2 great guests with us today to help us to think about that. Greg Whittick, returning, who was our very first guest here on Conversant podcast, and also Michael Wadsworth. Really excited to have these guys here to talk about this subject together. So just an intro first of all. Greg, you were on before, but tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe why this subject you got something to say on it.
I'm, as I said before, I retired as a pastor about 3 years ago. I've been teaching at KST now since, I think, 2011, somewhere around there. I've taught various things over the years. I've been teaching the atoning work of Jesus module now for, I think, about 5 or 6 years. So hopefully I've got something to say on it. Otherwise, we've got the wrong person, one of the wrong people teaching it. So that's my interest in it. I do teach other things at KST, but that's the main reason I'm here today, I think.
Good stuff. Thank you, Greg. Absolutely. And also, Michael, great to have you on for the first time, but I'm sure not the last. Tell us a little bit about yourself, what you get up to in your day job and your family, and why you've got something to say on this one.
Yeah, good to be here. So I'm Michael, based in Derby, married to Nay, got a little 1-year-old called Simeon, not quite 1, but he will be probably by the time this goes out, and a little dog called Rue as well. My day job is I work for the Queen's Foundation in Birmingham, which is an ecumenical theology college that particularly train Anglican ordinands, Methodist ordinands, Pentecostal ministers, and independent students. And my particular role there is helping develop courses that onboard people who haven't necessarily studied theology before to encourage them to study theology. So quite a lot of that is kind of foundation work, but trying to get people to the stage that they might consider doing a little bit more full-time study. And I have to say, it's a job that I only have because a few years ago, KST got me involved in teaching on some of their modules as well. So they definitely helped out my CV when it came to applications. But in terms of KST, I think I taught quite a lot of stuff now, but do modules on Genesis. I do this atoning work of Jesus module with Greg. I've also been involved in Romans and Revelation and Paul, and I'm sure other things as well. We've done some short courses, but basically I just like nerding out and talking to people who are interested in talking about nerdy things. So it's good to be on the podcast.
There we go. You get perfect guest, because that's what we're doing here. See if we can get other people getting good conversations as a result of our conversation. And I guess that's what KST is about in the end, is trying to help this theology thing not become part of the ivory tower situation, but the real life thinking of real people, and that it really makes a difference in their life. And I know both of you bring that in what you do at KST. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. Quick question before you get going. Then what is the last book that you read? I always say, and or that you wish you read, but I'm guessing you guys, you probably actually have read them. Not like me. Go on, Greg, you can go first. What's the last book you read?
It really is this one. I'm in the midst at the moment of reading Gustav Aulen's book, Christus Victor, which is about atonement models. That's no accident in some ways, but it's one of those books that I've often read it quoted, and in the end I decided, no, I do actually need to read this book. So I'm about 2/3 the way through it at the moment.
Nice.
I recently tried to read that, and I have a secondhand bookshop that I often go to. And I wrote to the guy because he sent me a message saying they had it in stock. And so I was like, yeah, I finally want to buy Christus Victor. And he was like, oh, it's gone.
Right.
So I don't know if you bought it, Greg, but I haven't read it yet.
Wow.
It's actually on per Lego as well.
Oh, there you go. Okay, well, no excuse.
It's quite a good translation. So
I do have a copy, and I think I have read most of it. I will say that.
There you go. Well done.
But it was a while ago now. When was it published, Greg?
1923, I think, somewhere around there.
That's old. That's old.
Yeah, it's a book that everybody refers to in discussing atonement narratives, and I always prefer, if I can, to go back to the source rather than read other people's opinions of it.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Good bit of proper research. That's what we like to see. Good stuff. So, just to say again, at the end of this podcast, we're going to hear from both of you about your pet theological peeve, which, must be so exciting for people. They're going to listen right to the end to hear the as you put it, Greg, the grumpiness of our guests. That's what I'm after. A bit of that. So we'll come back to that. What's your pet theological peeve? But our subject for today is this question: why did Jesus die? And we're just after the Easter weekend. Might have been clever to get this out before, but hey, it didn't happen. After the Easter weekend, obviously we're remembering the death of Jesus, resurrection of Jesus, and yeah, that's my question really. Why did Jesus die? That's our conversation for today. Why does it matter? And I know that our approach when we talk about this in KST is really to look at how people have thought about this historically. And I know that your guys' emphasis is historically, as in like their context. Why have they talked about this in their context? Is that right? Do you kind of cover that in a historical sense as well as just a pure theological sense? Michael, is that what your approach is?
Yeah, I think what we want to recognize is when people talk about atonement, they often use the language of theory or model, and I guess I'm resistant to both of those terms because I think theory implies one over and against all the others, and that one theory must be right and the other's wrong, and I don't necessarily think that's a helpful way of thinking about things. And I think the language of model implies that it's kind of it's working idea, it's a prototype, and all the rest of it. And I think that kind of gets us somewhere, but it I like talking about stories. What are the stories that people have told? What are the narratives that people have told around what Jesus has done and what his death has achieved? And actually, one of the realities is we can all tell stories about the same event, and all of those stories can be true, but they are based on our experience and our understanding and our perception of them. So it's not like there's anything that's less truthful about different stories, but the fact is that we can begin to understand and appreciate, well, why are these stories different? And so what we try and do is talk about, well, what are the stories that have emerged about what Jesus has done, and why are those stories the way that they are? Why are some of the features in there? What's some of the cultural context, and what are some of the things that are influencing the way that people are talking about what Jesus has done, I suppose. And that's how we try to do it. There has to be a way of separating out these different things. And that seemed as good as any.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I guess that's part of the problem when we start talking about what's the purpose of Jesus' death, is it becomes a theory or a theology, but really it's as you said, is a way of telling a story that expresses a problem, a solution, and a result, I guess. So they basically the three key points of a story. And if you're like, it's not easy, is it, to even describe the problem of humanity, of the world, and how you identify that problem probably determines what kind of solution might be needed.
Yeah, and I think maybe even not even talk about problem solution feel very clinical. So we start to talk in terms of what's the tension, what's the conflict,
Sure.
Think in terms of narrative plot, right? And then what's the dramatic kind of climax of how that tension, that conflict is overcome. So trying to put it more in those plot narrative terms, I think is a bit more fun.
Sure.
And I think the other thing we've tried to do is to demonstrate that each of these arose in a particular culture as a way of explaining what Jesus had done to the people in that particular culture. The reason I first did that when I first started teaching it, was to try and take some of the conflict out of the whole discussion. 5 years, 6 years ago, however long it was, we were still in the tail end of a much more heated debate about these things. And most of our students, and most of us probably, grew up with one particular model, and haven't thought more widely or understood that people have explained Jesus' death in different ways over the centuries. And as we look at the historical context in which a lot of these models arose, narratives, we understand better that actually they were trying to explain the work of Jesus in ways that the people around them could understand. And one of our goals in the whole module is to try and encourage the students to think about, how do we explain the work of Jesus to people in the world and the culture and the moment in which we're living?
Yes.
Rather than trying to set these narratives against one another and come up with the best one. We're trying to get some integration and synthesis of them to bring them together rather than pull them apart.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll come back to that at the end to make sense of that. And I do, I think this kind of, is there one model to rule them all sort of idea. And there has been conflict, hasn't there? And I guess people's narratives, models, whatever they've called it, have become the gospel, and it becomes a conversation around what is the gospel. And obviously that's crucially important. And what I'm hearing in what you're saying is much more positive than that, which is like Jesus speaks to every culture in language and pictures and models they understand. We believe that wholeheartedly. We celebrate in that sense that diversity because it says this event of Jesus' death isn't just a past event that could be theorized about, but there's something current and real in people's experience as a result, I guess. So it's a real positive thing to value the message within history of what this means.
Yeah, and we often say to the students, our aim with the module is to leave them with a bigger view of Jesus.
Right.
Rather than a right view of Jesus or the specific take on Jesus. Trying to say, actually, we want to give you an enlarged picture that wants to take you into deeper worship, a more profound appreciation of the vastness and the glory of what the cross represents.
Yeah, brilliant. So, based on that, then let's dig into that. And I guess you could kind of cut the cloth a number of different ways, or cut the cake in a number of different ways in terms of how you divide where these models sit. But we're just going to investigate three of those kind of three models to get us going. Or sorry, narratives, let's call them that, because I'm definitely down for that. I'm there for that, totally. And as you mentioned, Greg, I guess if you could kick off, please, with penal substitution. And this is definitely one where whether people have heard that term or not, it is probably what they have basically assumed. Is that fair? Could you tell us a bit about it and get us going on that conversation?
Yes. I mean, for anyone who became a Christian in the latter part of the 20th century or the early part of the 21st, I think penal substitution was presented as the gospel. I can remember sitting in certain evangelists' meetings where he'd give a very detailed breakdown of the agony of Jesus dying and then introduce what we understand now as penal substitution. So essentially, penal substitution's narrative is that God is holy and can't dwell with sin, that sin has to be dealt with, that humanity is unable to deal with its own sin because the nature of sin is so great and so awful. And therefore, God came down in the form of Jesus, died on the cross to save humanity from their sin, to obtain forgiveness for sin, and to create a way for humanity to approach God and to be able to be in the presence of God. That's it in a nutshell. I think that's fairly familiar to most people. Well, sorry, you were about to interrupt, Mark.
Yeah, like that. Isn't that just what is like that? Is there anything else to say? That sounds the gospel. I mean, do we need any other theories or understandings or narratives other than that? Isn't that what everyone feels?
I think we do, and we'll probably come to that in a minute. It has some advantages in that it was very easy to explain in a logical way and in a way that brings people to a point of decision. So it appeals greatly to evangelists in speaking to non-Christians, again, because of its simplicity. I think there are a number of difficulties with it nowadays. One is that we live in a world. So let's deal with the advantages of it first. Sorry, I always try and make the students come up with the positives before we talk about any of the things that are negative. So the positives of it are that it takes God's holiness seriously. Mm-hmm. It takes sin seriously. It is easy and straightforward to explain to people, and it provides a very good mechanical analysis of what happened when Jesus died on the cross. So, I think all of those are very positive. And I'm not denying penal substitution here. There is some controversy about the nature of how penal the substitution was.
Penal meaning punishment, is that right?
Punishment, and Jesus paying the penalty. And then there was famously the incident where it was described as cosmic child abuse, although having looked at it, I think he might actually have said it's not cosmic child abuse, but that's a whole separate discussion.
Okay, we're not going. That's 20 years old, that debate. We'll come back to that.
Yes,
but the idea that's reflected in that is it's possible to tell the story in a way where the father is punishing the son, and that doesn't sound in extreme violence. That doesn't sound very good at all.
No. And in a world where people don't really recognize sin or recognize that sin is a problem, back in 50 years ago, we all understood what sin was because we heard about it in school assemblies and things. Younger people nowadays have never heard of that message and don't understand themselves as being sinful. So for us to be saying to people, you're sinful, and particularly to young people who already have mental health issues, doesn't always work well, and doesn't communicate with a culture which doesn't necessarily recognize its own sinfulness.
Interesting.
So the power of that model, I think, is beginning to wane because it just doesn't play in the culture in which we're living nowadays. If you're going to try and use that model, you really need to do some work up front to persuade people of what their sinfulness is, what the consequences of that sinfulness are, before you can even start on explaining the penal substitution narrative. It's also a comparatively modern narrative. It was only really first articulated by Charles Hodge. Now, I know who lived in the 19th century. He was a theologian. Many people would probably say, or certainly people who hand in essays on the subject who just want to defend penal substitution will say that it's there in the Bible and in Paul. It is, but it's not all that's there. And also it doesn't really account for how we're transformed. It doesn't account for the rest of Jesus' life, and his work, his healing ministry, and his teaching. It doesn't account for a lot of the Old Testament scripture. It's arguable whether the whole Levitical thing gets drawn into it or not. So there are a number of things where and I'm not knocking penal substitution here, but it doesn't give a full account. And I think what we would argue is that there's more. Jesus is more magnificent than this, is bigger than this. And yes, humanity's sin needed to be dealt with, but there's more to it than that. I think that's we can talk more about it if you like, but that's the 5-minute version.
Yeah, good. What do you think, Michael? What's your, response to that, or further thoughts?
Well, further thoughts on penal substitution. Yeah, I think I was definitely going to highlight the lateness of this, because I think people think that this is what Christians have always thought across time and space, and I think it's worth recognizing the fact that you can trace elements of it back to Augustine and through Anselm and into the Reformation, but actually in terms of the kind of systematic model that we have, it is still relatively new, even if it became quite ubiquitous in the 20th century. I think one of the observations I would make is it's quite a legal model. So you might have heard it described in terms of kind of this idea of, it's like the judge giving you the guilty sentence, but then getting down off the dock and saying, I'll take the sentence onto myself, which is a nice metaphor until you go, well, is that justice? Right. If what people are really after here is cosmic justice, then it's not justice that the guilty party goes through and the innocent party is punished. That is actually injustice. And so, I think it's one of these things we have to be careful how we talk about it. And I agree with Greg as well that the penal element of it is potentially tricky for different people. We very easily lump quite a lot of ideas together or try and see everything through the lens of penal substitution. So if you're going to read, the Leviticus sacrificial system through the lens of penal substitution, you're going to get in hot water because actually the animal isn't being punished in that system. There is no punishment of the animal going on. Actually, what you're trying to do is access the life of the animal in order to purify divine space. But people kind of go, well, penal substitution must be it. So I have to read everything through that lens. And then actually what they end up doing is confusing themselves. Yeah. So again, I guess similarly to Greg, it's not saying, okay, well, this is an unhelpful story, but it's saying, A, we need to tell the story with care. And B, we need to recognize that if it's not the full thing, then not everything has to be read through that lens. Okay. If you want to read all of Paul through penal substitution, you're going to miss out on quite a lot. If you want to read all of Romans through penal substitution, you're going to miss out on quite a lot. You're going to get very obsessed with, Romans 3 and miss out on the glories of Romans 8. So,
yeah, interesting. And I guess it's very good at describing the meaning of Jesus' death, but it's not so good, it seems to me, at explaining the benefits of resurrection. And there's a funny thing
or ascension. Or
ascension, right, absolutely, which we come to get a bit more. But even resurrection, I'm thinking of Easter Sunday, and the number of times I've been in an Easter Sunday church service and people tell me a lot about Good Friday, but not very much about Easter Sunday, because that's all there is. And I guess if you say that Jesus died to take our eternal death as punishment, and then he's resurrected in 3 days, it's like that he's not. It's a cheat. Exactly. He's not actually paid all of the punishment. So it becomes a bit, the resurrection becomes awkward in that mini narrative that we're talking about, it seems to me. Is that fair?
Yeah, not only is it a kind of a cosmic injustice that the judge goes to prison, but then the judge, rigs a jailbreak for 3 days later, and you kind of go, no punishment's really been paid here at all.
Yeah. So the narrative, again, we're not saying all of that's rubbish. We're saying that you've got to tell the story well in order to make sense of that and really get the power of that, I think.
Yeah.
It is also worth noting a couple of things I forgot to say were, Luther and Calvin both set out versions of penal substitution. And Calvin was a lawyer. Luther, I think, started training as a lawyer. I can't remember if he ever fully trained as a lawyer. And so this kind of courtroom lawyerly type thing. And I read commentaries on Romans which talk about this being courtroom language, but I don't see courtroom language necessarily in those passages in Romans. And I think we have possibly read something more into some of those passages than is appropriate or is helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess we use courtroom and then we think, certainly for us here, we think English courtroom. And in that sense, the law is something above the judge. And I've certainly grown up with that sense, that the law is something that has to be honored above the character of the judge, and God's the judge, and almost God's under the law in that sense. And that seems to be an English courtroom thing, where I think in the Old Testament, in the biblical view, the judge embodies the law in himself. It's about his character, I think, rather than this disembodied set of rules, I guess, that sits above it.
It's a very modern Western version of justice, and actually one of the Greg, who's
it's Baker and Green. I Oh dear, I had it on the tip of it, the Scandal of the Cross. Is it Restoring the Scandal of the Cross? I can't remember the full title now.
I think rediscovering
or recovering the Scandal of the Cross. I think it might be. In there they have a chapter on a missionary in Japan where this narrative just did not work. People could not grasp it because in Japan, it's not about punishment. It was about restoration. And so, again, it's very embedded in Western culture and in a Western legal model that doesn't even translate to other cultures around the world. So that's not to negate any of the need for dealing with sin or the problems about unholy people approaching a holy God. They do all have to be dealt with, but that's not the full story. And Scott McKnight ends up referring to it, I don't think it's in the book that we recommend, but another book. He talks about the problem of sin management, where actually the atonement becomes simply about managing the problem of sin. That's not to say that sin is not a problem, but if our gospel is only about managing sin, then it's only half a gospel, in my view.
Okay. Well, maybe that helps us kind of segue into moving on from there. Because if this penal substitution is good, but really it's only dealing with a small part of the story, is there a bigger story that even makes sense, better sense of penal substitution, maybe, or just a completely different story? Anyway, I don't know. Michael, can you take us on from here? Is there and think about this Christus Victor idea? How does that?
Yeah, so Christus Victor is an earlier way of talking about the cross that has had a great resurgence, I'd say, in the last sort of 50 years or so, particularly thanks to people like Tom Wright, who writes extensively about this in all of his many, many books that he releases a year. But the basic plot, if you like, is this idea that humanity is kind of in some way caught up in this cosmic battle between God and the forces of good and God's good divine plan for the world and the devil and the forces of evil. You know, think about the language of principalities and powers. There are these powers that have in some way taken over mankind, have enslaved mankind, are running amok within creation. And actually what Jesus does on the cross is he judges them, but ultimately the way he does that is, you could talk about, say, if one of the greatest tools of the principalities and powers is the fear of death, this idea that humans have to survive and they have to do whatever they need to survive because death is the ultimate kind of weapon that can be used against them. And then what happens in Christus Victor is the principalities and powers throw everything they possibly can at Jesus, including the worst possible, imaginable, most shameful, most horrific death. And yet what Jesus does is he absorbs it all into himself in a way that, is non-violent back, takes everything that the world could possibly throw at him, and then is still then resurrected and defeats ultimately the power that death has over humanity. And in that way, humanity can be free. It's worth saying that this was a way that the cross was talked about for about 1,000 years, like quite a dominant way. And there's quite a number of kind of, you could almost see it as a genre, and then there's lots of stories in that genre. If this is the Western, and there's lots of different versions of this, right? So there are some versions that see, the devil as kind of enslaving humanity, and Jesus being the kind of the ransom that tricks Satan to release humanity, and then hey presto, actually the ransom manages to escape death himself. So think about kind of when Aslan offers himself in replacement for Edmund in the Chronicles of Narnia. You kind of go, well, actually, he offers himself as a ransom, but it was about getting Edmund back, and then actually the witch doesn't even get Aslan in the end either, right? That's a version of this story. Or there are versions of it that get very elaborate when they want to talk about Jesus going down into hell and rescuing all the people out of hell, and actually even hell is emptied by Jesus's death. He now holds the keys of death and Hades, right? So there's lots of different ways of talking about it, but ultimately they all come down to this idea of it's about God versus the powers and about humanity being subjected to and in some way unable to help themselves because they're caught up in this kind of cosmic battle. But that Jesus ultimately has the victory over all of these things. So it's a lovely story. It's a powerful story. It's a compelling story. We love it when the good guys win over the bad guys, especially against all odds. I think if I was going to be really critical, I think one of the challenges of it is depending on, again, how you tell the story, you can make it sound like God and Satan are equal and opposite forces. Right. And you kind of go, well, is that what I think about God? Surely I think that God is more powerful than that. And depending on how you tell the story, it might make it sound like, well, why did it take God thousands of years to have that victory? Could God not have had that victory almost instantaneously? What was the whole Israel thing in the Old Testament about? You could almost jump, if you wanted, from Genesis 3 to Mark and miss out most of the stuff in between if you really wanted to push this narrative. Okay. And it doesn't necessarily offer the same beautiful mechanical explanation as to how sin is dealt with, right? But one of the things I really value about it, and I think is particularly powerful, is it sees sin not just as something that is like a personal thing that I do, but is like a systemic thing that I can be overpowered by. I think most of us recognize that not only at times do we find ourselves doing things that we wish we didn't do, and we kind of feel like powerless to kind of, we're lacking the self-control to do stuff. But on a broader scale, there's plenty of stuff in the world that I feel is terribly wrong and I feel completely powerless to do anything about. And so this idea that actually God is taking responsibility for dealing with these things that are too big and too powerful and too mighty for me to address, I think is particularly cogent. And I have to say, I found this really helpful. I was a youth worker for 10 years, and I found it particularly helpful when I talk about the cross with young people, because rather than having to talk about penal substitution and start by convincing young people that they're really, really bad people, before I can get to the good news, I had to give them the really, really bad news, right?
Sorry, guys, you don't feel bad enough yet.
Yeah. Let me spend the next hour explaining how utterly depraved you are, and then we can talk about how Jesus doesn't care about that. Instead, I was able to say, hey, as young people, you look at the world with a certain level of anxiety. Mental health issues amongst young people are rife right now. You look at the world in fear, and with a certain level of powerlessness, you feel like you lack agency. And yet, actually, I think there's something that Jesus wants to do to redeem the things that you want to see redeemed, to restore the things that you want to see restored. And actually, what's great is he wants to invite you into that process with him. Now, that's a story that I think has traction with young people because they want agency, they want to be involved, but sometimes they just don't know where to begin. And to be able to point people to not just the God who's able where they're not able, but who invites them as well, I think is a very powerful story.
Yeah, very good. And so in that Christus Victor narrative, we're saying that just name it for me again. What does Jesus dying do?
So I think what Jesus dying does is it exposes the powers as ultimately weak.
Okay.
If the best thing that powers and principalities can do is kill us, if death is the ultimate weapon, and actually death doesn't hold Jesus down, and actually Jesus is able to do everything he wants to do. Jesus is able to talk about enemy love and then to perfectly and beautifully exemplify that without having to resist, because he knows that actually ultimately even when his enemies put him to death it doesn't, where, O death, is your victory, where, O death, is your sting, is ultimately the thing that's going on.
So resurrection then becomes the primary.
Resurrection suddenly becomes way more important in this story, yeah. And
so, just thinking that I read it on Sunday, you got Acts 2. How does Peter first interpret the Jesus event, or Jesus' death rather? It's death could not hold him, isn't it? Like that, which is what you said. Like it's actually the way that Peter interpreted it. Day of Pentecost, probably the first evangelistic sermon, certainly one that we recorded post Jesus. Like that was the interpretation. Death could not hold him.
Yeah.
And in the world that we're living in at the moment, I think evil is something we're having to contend with in a way that we've not felt it as tangibly for quite a while. I think Christus Victor, in recognizing evil and in in a narrative that says Jesus has dealt with evil and conquered the powers of evil here, is a message that is actually very potent for the world in which we're living at the present time.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you both made there. I guess the penal substitution narrative can become a bit individualistic, can't it? Like, it's me and it's my problem. And I guess we look around and go, it's them and each of those individuals' problems. But you've kind of alluded to the sense in which evil is not just the sin of my own actions or my own heart, but sin's endemic in the world in a far more pervasive way, destructive way. What does God do about that, I suppose?
Yeah, and I think sin in terms of its as a principality or a power or a system, I use the example when we were teaching this just before Easter of when you buy a t-shirt, it's really hard now to know how much suffering and pain and misery has gone into the production of that t-shirt, how much economic exploitation, how much modern day slavery, how many children have been potentially damaged in the process of you buying that t-shirt. And that's not that anyone who's buying the t-shirt is intentionally trying to be sinful. It's just that it's this thing which we short of deconstructing everything that we know in terms of how our modern society reacts and modern economics and commerce operates. And I can't do that. But I do believe that God wants to restore humanity in all of its fullness and to restore the systems and to restore the ways in which we interact with the world and to restore an Eden. But I haven't got the first clue about how to go about that.
And Christus Victor is a more communitarian, I suppose would be the best word. It is a counter to the individualism that we have applied to penal substitution, I think I would say. So particularly and there are other kind of sub-narratives, as Michael alluded to. There's ransom, there's recapitulation, and recapitulation particularly views the whole of humanity as needing redemption and being redeemed. So Christus Victor is much less individualistic in its nature, and is a bigger picture because it also makes sense of Jesus' healing ministry, much of his teaching ministry, makes sense of this idea of having to bind the strong man, whether that's at the cross or in the wilderness, it still makes much more sense of that kind of idea. So it's going much more deeply back into the text of the New Testament than a way of presenting, than a simplistic presentation of one aspect of Jesus' work. Are we beginning to convert you here, Mark?
I'm on the converted side. Don't you worry about that.
At the same time, I think one of the challenges, as Greg says, is because it tries to account for so many different things, right? I think Christus Victor makes a bit more sense of the Old Testament story. If you see Jesus as the new Son of God in place of Israel, who was the first Son of God. It's the language used. Israel is my firstborn son.
Thanks for that.
So yeah, you're welcome. I'll come back. But so when you add recapitulation and ransom and these things together, it's powerful, it creates great account of stuff, but then it means it feels like there's so much more to explain. And one of the challenges is it isn't pithy. You're not going to be able to get away with doing this as a door-to-door presentation or, in a nice little, you've got 5 minutes as part of a CU night in a pub somewhere. Or you might be able to give a tidbit, but you're not going to be able to kind of do the full thing justice. And I think that's one of the reasons why Tom Wright has to write a dozen books a year.
Let's get this. And I think that's crucially important, isn't it? Like, we're talking about a gospel, a good news of Jesus' death and resurrection, as we're adding in, and life. That really makes a difference in people's lives, and being able to communicate that really making a difference in people's lives is really important. So if we want it to be, if we think it's helpful, we've got to find ways to talk about it. I think that really help that. But there is I think there's a problem. I don't think you've mentioned this yet. I think there's a problem. The problem is that I just become like a victim. I'm just a victim of these great powers. I mean, penal substitution makes it clear that it's my responsibility. My actions are my responsibility, and I am guilty for that, and therefore I need forgiveness. Like that is definitely part of this gospel narrative. it's not, I'm not just a victim of something other than myself, am I? Is that a risk of Christus Victor, that it says, you're a victim of the powers of evil, Jesus come to rescue you, all you've got to do is trust in him? Like, where's personal responsibility?
Yeah, I do think there is personal responsibility in it. Although when you said, am I just a victim? My brain instantly went, oh, forgive him, Lord, for he doesn't know what he's doing. But, at the same time, there is complicity within the system, right? But I think the point that Christus Victor would make is a lot of that is around this fear of death and this need to survive and this grasping for, how do I do this on my own terms? How can I make sure? Because some of it is around just doubting, I suppose. If part of the backstory is that people doubt the goodness of God and the efficacy of God to look after them, and this is beginning to go back into the recapitulation side of things. But what Jesus does is he demonstrates that, oh no, if you can live this obedient life and God will raise you up. That's what goes on in Philippians 2. The reason Paul can say, hey, act like Jesus did, because actually he was obedient even to the point of death, even death on the cross, and therefore God raised him up. Okay. And actually you should have this same mindset in the belief that God will raise you up. And that's why Paul says, I can count all of this stuff that might otherwise be my security measure, I can count it as rubbish, because actually I believe that I will become like him in his resurrection. So I do think there is something about kind of our personal involvement in this. But I could see Greg is desperate to chime in, so I just
not desperate, and it's slightly tangential. But I would argue that Christus Victor gives agency to the poor and the oppressed because it communicates to them that Jesus has done something to help them in their lowly state. We're speaking here a few days after the death of the Pope, and there was a man who was concerned about the poor and the oppressed, but about giving them agency. And I think Christus Victor says to the poor, the oppressed, people who realize that they are in that kind of state, that actually Jesus has done something about this to save you from these powers that are oppressing you and to enable you to live without being totally subject to them. So, no, that's bad phrasing, but so I think there is I'd almost flip that the other way and say that it's actually giving agency to people who are victims. And we need to remember that we come to this as middle-class men in a prosperous nation, and a large proportion of the population of the world are not in that situation where they feel totally self-sufficient and comfortable. I'm not saying we're totally comfortable, but a lot of people in the world are oppressed, are suffering under oppression, at risk of being deported or any of these other things. Right. And so something that gives people in that situation agency and a sense that God has seen them and is concerned about them, I don't think is a passive victim mentality.
Yeah, right. And what's the good news for the poor and the oppressed? Right. Is the good news you should feel even worse? Like, you feel bad. So that's a whole other thing. And I guess the problem of, if there's someone who's oppressed, then there is someone who is an oppressor or a system or whatever, like that. It gets embodied. The evil gets embodied in people and through people and because of people. Yeah. So there's a two-way. There's still guilt there, isn't there? I suppose, because in what ways are we complicit in those oppressive systems or oppressing people just straight as it is?
I think at the same time, that potentially could be framed as a negative, is that if you are an oppressed person, sometimes it might be quite difficult to see that Jesus has been victorious. If you are deeply oppressed and someone comes along and goes, don't worry, Jesus has the ultimate victory, you go, well, what victory? Now. I'm looking around me going, where is freedom here?
I mean, if you're a Ukrainian in a foxhole with missiles and drones going overhead,
very difficult.
We get into eschatology there, but that's a whole
different. That's another podcast again.
Yeah, that's the other one. No way, no. I mean, I guess that's. I ended up there on Easter Sunday in our church. Was okay, death could not hold him, but also we live in the midst of death as a present reality. So if death is defeated, well, 1 Corinthians 15 says death in the end is going to be the last enemy defeated. So death is both defeated and will be defeated. And that's got to be a Christus Victor. Part of that maybe complexity of the Christus Victor narrative is, yes, there is a victory of death, cross, resurrection, ascension, but there's still a full impact, a full effect of that victory that is yet to be felt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that is definitely, again, part of the challenge of it. It's a great, compelling story, but it's an epic that needs really careful delivery.
Yeah, long. Yeah, nice. Good. Yeah. I always go to Isaiah 59 on this, honestly, and I wish I would spend a bit of time on it, but that because people read that chapter and get lost, but I think it's the gospel embedded in that. If you listen to this, have a read of Isaiah 59, see if you can spot a bit of Christus Victor going on there, or something similar anyway. That's the end of part 1 of this podcast, looking at why did Jesus die. We've talked about penal substitution, and we talked about Christus Victor. Join us next time as we go further. What other models or stories, narratives might we talk about?